Hey, I'm Daniel. I spent 20 years as a professor of religious history. Then I discovered something that cost me my career, but I couldn't keep it to myself. What Spinoza found, it changes everything you think you know.
Stop telling yourself Jesus died for your sins. The Romans didn't care about your sins, they cared about power. And Spinoza found the document that proves the charge was never blasphemy. It was sedition. The church has known this for 17 centuries. Now I need you to look at something, not a theological argument, not a doctrinal dispute, something simpler than that, something physical, the method of execution. Because here is the detail that 20 centuries of theology have stepped over without pausing, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Blasphemy under Jewish law was punishable by stoning. Leviticus 24, verse 16. The prescription is explicit, it is not ambiguous. It is not a matter of interpretation or scholarly debate. The Torah names the punishment. Take the blasphemer outside the camp and let all the congregation stone him. That is the law. That was the law in the first century. That was the law that the temple authorities enforced when they had jurisdiction. And there is a case in the New Testament itself that proves they applied it. Acts chapter 7. Stephen, a man accused of blasphemy against the temple and the law. Stephen is dragged before the Sanhedrin. He gives a speech that enrages them. They take him outside the city. They stone him to death. The punishment matches the crime. The method matches the law. Whatever you think about the theology of the book of Acts, the legal procedure it describes is historically coherent. Blasphemy, stoning, the system working is documented. Jesus was crucified. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not with any theological explanation, just with the mechanics. If the charge was blasphemy, the punishment under Jewish law was stoning. If the charge was blasphemy and the temple authorities wanted him dead, they had precedent, they had procedure, they had the legal framework to do what they did to Stephen. They did not use it. Instead, the man was handed to a Roman governor and executed by a Roman method. Crucifixion. Nails, wood, public display on a road outside the city walls. Roman, in every particular. There is a detail in the execution itself that no one talks about, but there is something I need to show you first. An inscription. The inscription that Pilate refused to change, and the reason he refused tells you everything. I was at a conference some years ago, north of England, the kind of academic gathering where the corridors between sessions are more productive than the sessions themselves, where the real conversations happen standing by hospitality tables with cold tea and paper cups, and the sound of other people's footsteps fading toward the next lecture hall. I had been talking to someone, a Roman law specialist, not a theologian, a classicist, a man who had spent his career with Roman legal codes and provincial administration, not with gospel narratives or Christological disputes. We had been introduced by a mutual acquaintance during a break, and the conversation had moved, as these things do, when two people work adjacent territory, toward the points where our fields overlap. I mentioned the titulus crucis, the inscription that Roman practice required to be posted above the condemned, naming the crime for which they were being executed. I asked him something I had been carrying for a while, whether the phrase Rex Judaeorum, King of the Jews, the inscription that all four canonical Gospels agree was placed above Jesus on the cross, whether that would have been understood in Roman legal terms as a religious or a political charge. He looked at me, not with curiosity, with the expression of someone who has been asked whether water is wet. He said, "It is a Roman criminal titulus. It names a crime against the state. There is no ambiguity whatsoever." He said it in the tone you use for things that are obvious. Then the corridor emptied, and he moved to the next session, and I stood there with my cold tea and the particular feeling that comes when someone outside your field states plainly what your field has spent centuries making complicated. Rex Judaeorum, King of the Jews, 4 Gospels, 4 different authors, 4 different decades, 4 different communities with 4 different theological agendas, and all 4 of them agree on the inscription. That is one of the rarest points of unanimity in the entire New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who disagree on the circumstances of the birth, the details of the ministry, the words spoken at the Last Supper, and the sequence of events at the empty tomb, all record the same 3 words above the cross. King of the Jews. Not blasphemer, not heretic, not false prophet, not Sabbath breaker. King, a political title, a claim to sovereignty. In Roman law, claiming kingship in a province of the empire was crimen lesi majestatis, treason against Caesar. The titulus named a political crime. The four most divergent documents in the New Testament agree that it did. And there is something in the Gospel of John that most people read past. John 19 verses 21 and 22. The chief priests come to Pilate after the inscription has been posted. They object. They say, "Do not write King of the Jews, but that this man said, 'I am King of the Jews.'" They want the inscription to record a claim, not a fact. They want the theology, not the politics. And Pilate's response is 5 words. "What I have written, I have written." He refused to change it. The Roman governor, the man with imperium over the province, the man with the sole authority to execute, refused to reframe the charge as a religious claim. He left it as a political one, because that is what it was. And the men who objected knew the difference. They wanted the inscription to say something about religion. The man who ordered the execution kept it about power. In a moment, I will show you exactly where in the Gospels themselves the accusers changed the charge. They walked into one room with blasphemy and walked out of another room with treason. The texts record the switch. It is in the narrative. It has always been in the narrative. Now I need to take you through the legal architecture, because without it, what I have shown you so far is suggestive but not conclusive. With it, the picture locks. Crucifixion was a Roman punishment, not a punishment Rome borrowed or adapted. A punishment Rome reserved for specific categories of crime. 3 categories, consistently documented across the period of provincial administration: seditio, political rebellion against Roman authority; latrocinium, banditry, which in Roman usage was often a euphemism for guerrilla resistance; and slave revolt. These were the crimes that warranted crucifixion, not theological offenses, not religious disputes. Political threats to Roman order. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish council of religious authorities in Jerusalem, did not have the authority to execute. This is stated directly in the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 31. The Jewish authorities say to Pilate, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." The phrase in Greek is clear. Scholars debate whether this restriction was absolute or whether there were narrow exceptions. But the majority position, based on the evidence we have from this period, is that under Roman occupation, capital punishment authority, the ius gladii, the right of the sword, rested with the Roman prefect, Pilate, not the Sanhedrin, not the high priest, Pilate. Which means that even if the Sanhedrin had found Jesus guilty of blasphemy, even if the religious charge was genuine, even if the temple authorities sincerely believed that this man had committed an offense against the law of Moses, they could not have him killed, not legally, not under the administrative framework of Roman Judea. They needed Rome, and Rome did not care about blasphemy. Rome cared about sedition. And here is where the Gospels themselves record the switch. This is the moment I asked you to hold. Luke chapter 23, verse 2. The accusers bring Jesus before Pilate, and the charges they present are not the charges from the Sanhedrin trial. They do not say this man claimed to be the Son of God. They do not say this man spoke against the temple. They say, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king, forbidding tribute to Caesar, claiming to be a king." Those are political charges. Those are the charges that would activate Roman legal authority. Those are the charges that would give Pilate jurisdiction. The accusers themselves, in the canonical text in the Bible you were handed, changed the charge from blasphemy to treason when they walked from the Sanhedrin to the praetorium. The Gospels record this. It has never been hidden. It has simply never been emphasized, because emphasizing it changes everything. If the charge was treason, not blasphemy, then the crucifixion was a Roman political execution, not a theological sacrifice, not a cosmic transaction. A Roman governor exercising his authority to eliminate a perceived political threat. Spinoza saw something in this that his contemporaries missed entirely, but I need to build the rest of the case before I can show you what he found. 2 historians who had no reason to protect Jesus described his death. Neither of them mentioned blasphemy. Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian writing for Roman patronage, his Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Chapter 3, Section 3, contains the passage scholars call the Testimonium Flavianum. The original text has been worked over by later Christian copyists, but the scholarly reconstruction of the core text, the version that most historians accept as representing what Josephus actually wrote, reads, "Pilate condemned him to the cross." That is the verb, condemned. The subject is Pilate. The instrument is the cross. The framing is Roman legal action. There is no mention of blasphemy, no mention of a religious trial, no mention of the Sanhedrin's involvement. A Roman governor condemned a man to a Roman punishment. Tacitus, Roman senator, historian, writing approximately 80 years after the events. His Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44, written in the context of describing Nero's persecution of Christians after the fire of Rome, contains this: Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. Suffered the extreme penalty at the hands of one of our procurators. Tacitus does not describe a religious dispute. He describes a Roman execution carried out by a Roman official. The framing is administrative. The tone is bureaucratic. A man suffered the extreme penalty under a Roman governor. That is how Rome recorded it. Two independent witnesses, one Jewish, one Roman, neither Christian, neither with any theological reason to frame the execution in political rather than religious terms. Both of them described it the same way: a Roman governor, a Roman punishment, political authority exercised against a man Rome considered a threat. The silence about blasphemy in the external sources is not incidental, it is structural. The people who are not writing theology, the people who had no investment in the meaning of the death, describe the death as a political execution. It is only within the Christian narrative itself, within the theological framework that needed the death to mean something specific, that blasphemy appears as the charge. What happened after 312 changes everything. But I need to show you Spinoza first. I was teaching the Passion narrative in a university seminar, late in my career, the kind of course where the students were older, had come to biblical studies from other disciplines, brought different assumptions. There was a woman in the group, mature student, former solicitor. Second career. She had the particular quality of attention that people bring when they have spent a professional life reading documents for what they actually say, rather than for what they are supposed to mean. We were working through the trial before Pilate. I was presenting the standard harmonization, the version that draws from all four Gospels to construct a single coherent narrative in which the religious trial before the Sanhedrin leads to the political hearing before Pilate, as if both were steps in a single judicial process. She raised her hand. She said, "If blasphemy was a Jewish offense, why is a Roman governor presiding? Not aggressively, not rhetorically, as a procedural question, the kind of question a solicitor asks when the jurisdiction does not make sense." I gave the standard answer. I explained that the Sanhedrin lacked capital authority under Roman occupation, that they needed to refer the case to Pilate for execution. I said it smoothly. It was the answer I had given many times. It was the management version, the version that acknowledges the procedural complexity while leaving the theological framework intact. She wrote something in her notebook. She did not press. I walked back to my office. I sat. I did not start the next thing I had planned, because she had asked the obvious question, the question that a lawyer asks. If the crime was religious, why was the judge political? And the answer I had given her explained how the case moved from one authority to another. It did not explain why the charge changed in transit. It did not explain why the Sanhedrin brought blasphemy to their own proceedings and sedition to Pilate's. She saw what the theologian had been trained not to see. How do I put this? The training I received, the decades of scholarship I was formed by, had taught me to explain the shift in jurisdiction as a practical necessity. What it had never taught me to ask was why the charge itself was different on either side of the door. The Sanhedrin condemned him for claiming to be the Son of God. The accusers before Pilate charged him with forbidding tribute to Caesar and claiming to be a king. Those are not the same accusation translated into a different legal framework. Those are two different accusations, and nobody in 2,000 years of passion commentary seems to have been troubled by the switch the way a solicitor in a seminar room was troubled by it in the space of 10 seconds. That discomfort has not left me. I do not think it should. Spinoza's analysis in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, chapters 18 and 19, arrives at the same conclusion from a different direction. He is not reading the trial narrative as a legal problem. He is reading the movement as a political phenomenon. Jesus' language was politically combustible. That is the core of Spinoza's argument. The phrase kingdom of God, which runs through the synoptic gospels like a thread, was not heard by Roman ears as a theological metaphor. It was heard as a political claim. Kingdom language was insurrection language. To Roman provincial administration, a man who gathered crowds and spoke of a kingdom was not a theologian. He was a potential insurgent. And the temple cleansing. Spinoza notes this with the precision of someone who understands how power works in occupied territories. Jesus did not merely preach. He physically disrupted the operations of the temple. He overturned the tables of the money changers. He drove out the merchants. The temple was not a purely religious institution. It was the economic and political center of Jerusalem, operating under a joint arrangement between the Sadducean priestly aristocracy and the Roman administration. An attack on the temple was an attack on the economic nexus of the occupation. And the timing. Passover, the most politically volatile period of the year. Jerusalem swelled with pilgrims during Passover, tens of thousands of people from across the diaspora, many of them carrying the memory of Exodus, the founding narrative of liberation from foreign domination. The Roman garrison was reinforced during Passover, specifically because the risk of public disorder was at its highest. A man who entered Jerusalem during Passover, attracted large crowds and disrupted the temple, was not committing a religious offense. He was creating a security crisis. Spinoza saw something his contemporaries missed entirely. He saw that the question was never about theology. The question was about who controlled the narrative after the fact. The movement had been political. The execution had been political. But the religion that grew from the execution needed the death to be theological, needed it to be about God and sin and sacrifice, not about empire and sedition and the mechanics of Roman provincial control. The reframing was not a lie exactly. It was something more durable than a lie. It was an institutional necessity that hardened into doctrine over centuries until the doctrine became indistinguishable from history. That is what Spinoza described. Not conspiracy. Pattern. The pattern of institutions that cannot afford to remember what actually happened. I need to tell you now what happened after 312, because this is where the reframing becomes visible. In 312 of the Common Era, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, or rather, adopted it as a political instrument. Within a generation, Christianity went from a persecuted movement within the empire to the preferred religion of the imperial apparatus. By the end of the 4th century, it would become the only legal religion. And here is the problem, that no one in the institutional church has ever had an incentive to state plainly. If Jesus was killed by Rome for political sedition, then the religion that Rome adopted as its state religion was founded on the execution of a political prisoner by the very state that was now claiming his name. Rome killed him, then Rome worshipped him. And the distance between those two facts had to be managed. The management took a specific form. The narrative that said Pilate was reluctant, that the crowd was responsible, that the Jewish authorities were the driving force, that the Roman governor tried to save him but yielded to pressure. That narrative was not merely theologically resonant, it was politically essential. The empire that had executed Jesus could not be the villain of its own state religion. Someone else had to bear the responsibility. And someone did. There is a gospel most people have never heard of that shows the rewriting in real time. The Gospel of Peter, a 2nd century text discovered in Akhmim in 1886, already shows the trajectory. In this text, the blame shifts further toward Herod and the Jewish authorities, further away from Pilate. Pilate is presented as even more sympathetic, more reluctant, more explicitly innocent. The progression is visible across the documents. From Mark's reactive Pilate, through Matthew's hand-washing Pilate, through Luke's jurisdictional referral Pilate, through John's philosophically engaged Pilate, to the Gospel of Peter's Pilate, who is almost a Christian sympathizer. Decade by decade, text by text, Pilate becomes more innocent, and the Jewish authorities become more responsible. By the 4th century, the process was complete. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church canonized Pontius Pilate as a saint. The man who ordered the crucifixion, or at least authorized it, became a holy figure. Because by that point, the narrative required it. If Rome was Christian, then Rome's representative at the execution had to be innocent, had to have been coerced, had to have been, in some version of the story, secretly sympathetic to the man he condemned. The charge of blasphemy served a theological purpose that sedition could never serve. If Jesus died for blasphemy, for claiming to be the Son of God, then his death was about his identity, about who he was, about the collision between divine truth and human blindness. That is a story about God. If Jesus died for sedition, for threatening Roman political order, then his death was about power, about an empire protecting itself from a movement it could not control. That is a story about politics. And a story about politics does not found a religion, it founds a revolution. The church needed a religion, not a revolution. This is the part I find hardest to say without sounding like I am accusing 20 centuries of theologians. But the evidence is the evidence. Sedition is embarrassing. Blasphemy is sacred. The charge was rewritten because the rewritten version served the institution that did the rewriting. There is a Gospel of Peter. There are external sources that frame the death in purely political terms. There is a titulus that names a political crime. There are gospel narratives that record the charge being switched from religious to political when the accusers moved from the Sanhedrin to the praetorium. There is a Roman legal framework in which crucifixion was reserved for political offenses. And there is a 17th century trajectory from persecuted movement to state religion that required the political execution to become a theological sacrifice. An 11th century monk wrote a theory that the entire church adopted, and it only works if the charge was blasphemy. I was sitting in my study in Norwich. Late evening, the kind of late where Norfolk goes dark outside the window, and the lamp on the desk becomes the only warmth in the room, the yellow circle on the papers, the rest of the house quiet. I had E.P. Sanders open on one side, the historical figure of Jesus, the chapter on the political context of the execution. On the other side, the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, chapter 19, Spinoza's analysis of how religious movements become political threats in occupied territories. I was reading them side by side, not as an exercise, because I had arrived at a point in my thinking where these two texts, written 3 centuries apart, were saying the same thing from different positions. Sanders from the position of a careful historian working with primary sources and archaeological evidence. Spinoza from the position of a philosopher who understood that institutions rewrite their founding narratives to serve present needs. And the political reading was so clear, so forensically obvious. The method of execution, the titulus, the legal framework, the charge switch in the trial narrative, the external sources, the institutional motive for reframing. Each piece taken alone is suggestive. Taken together, the direction is unmistakable. I sat with a discomfort that was not the kind I had expected. Not the pain of discovering something hidden, something different. The shame of having taught the theological version for 20 years without ever asking why the method of execution did not match the alleged crime. I had stood in lecture halls and explained the Passion narrative as a theological event. I had discussed the charge of blasphemy as if it were the settled historical fact. I had never, in 20 years of teaching the trial before Pilate, asked the question that the solicitor in my seminar had asked in 10 seconds. The tea was cold, the lamp was yellow, Norfolk was dark outside, and I was sitting with the particular weight of complicity through repetition. I had not lied, I had repeated, and repetition, sustained long enough, does the same work as lying. It makes the institutional version feel indistinguishable from the historical one. That is what Spinoza described. That is what I had done. The final piece is theological, and it is the most uncomfortable of all. Anselm of Canterbury, 11th century, his theory of substitutionary atonement. The idea that Jesus' death was a sacrifice that satisfied the demands of divine justice. That humanity had sinned against God, creating a debt that could only be repaid by a being of infinite worth, and that Jesus' death on the cross was that payment. The cross as altar, the execution as offering, the suffering as transaction. This theology in various forms became the dominant soteriological framework of Western Christianity. It is the theology behind the phrase "died for your sins." It is the theology that gives the crucifixion its cosmic meaning, that transforms a provincial Roman execution into the central event in the history of the universe. And it only works if the charge was blasphemy. If Jesus died for claiming to be the Son of God, then the death is about identity, about divine self-revelation rejected by human blindness. The sacrifice has theological content. The cross is the place where God and humanity meet in the most terrible and the most redemptive possible way. If Jesus died for sedition, for threatening Roman political order, then the cross is not an altar, it is a scaffold. Roman state violence applied to a man Rome considered dangerous, not a cosmic transaction, a political elimination. The same thing Rome did to thousands of other men in the same century for the same category of offense. The entire theology of substitutionary atonement rests on a rewritten charge sheet. The soteriology that defines Western Christianity depends on the version of the story in which the charge was religious. If the charge was political, the theology does not collapse exactly, but it loses its foundation. The cross becomes a Roman scaffold, not a divine altar. The suffering becomes state violence, not cosmic sacrifice. And the religion that was built on that suffering has to reckon with the possibility that the meaning it assigned to the death was not the meaning the death had when it happened. Spinoza's conclusion, which runs through the final chapters of the Tractatus like a cold current beneath the surface, is this: religion and politics have always been inseparable. The institutions that benefited most from Jesus' death are the ones who rewrote the reason for it, not out of malice, out of necessity. Because the truth, the political truth, the forensic truth, the truth of the titulus, and the method and the legal framework and the external sources, that truth does not found a religion, it founds a question. And institutions do not survive on questions, they survive on answers, even when the answers require the evidence to be rearranged. I'm not sure how to hold that. I've been working with it for years, and I'm not sure it resolves. I do not think it is supposed to resolve. I think the honest position is the uncomfortable one, the position that says the evidence points in a direction that the theology was not designed to accommodate. And what you do with that is not something I can tell you. It is something you carry. The cross was not a sacrifice. It was a Roman political scaffold. The charge was not blasphemy. It was sedition. The inscription said, "King of the Jews." The method said, "Political prisoner." The external sources said, "Roman execution." The accusers themselves changed the charge when they walked through the door, and the institution that inherited the story rewrote the reason, because the real reason would have made the story unusable. That is what the documents say. That is what Spinoza saw, and the distance between what the documents say and what you were taught is the distance this conversation has tried to cover. I do not know if I have covered it well enough. I know I have covered it honestly.
Tell me in the comments, what part of this challenged you the most? I read every single one. It helps me know what to research next. We're uncovering this together.